What's up, peeps? Hopefully you can hear this. I'm going to be recording this in my car, so apologies for any audio difficulties. Just figured while I had time with traffic, do a podcast. So, a couple weeks ago, I kind of started up my political podcast again. We talked about electoral reform, and I kind of want to grow this podcast. I'm sad that I didn't publish a podcast sooner. I'm recording this on December 14, 2016. Hopefully, I plan to do at least one more before the calendar year end. But like I said, I want to grow this podcast. If you want to come on the podcast and talk about politics and you live in the Bay Area, please let me know. If you want to talk about anything else, whether it be sports, comics, also let me know, because this podcast can be more than just politics, even if it's political orientated. I'll also put an email link or an email address in the YouTube video, which I'll post this on, so that you can send me questions if you want to say you agree with me, if you have arguments against me. I'll address those in the next podcast, and I definitely want to grow this. So please don't hesitate to contact me through social media or through email or even a comment on YouTube if you want to help this grow. That being said, I want to keep this relatively sweet. Hopefully we can do this in about 15 minutes or so. And what I want to talk about today, instead of 3 topics, is just the idea of political bubbles. Because there's this argument that sort of got thrown out in this election cycle that, liberals and conservatives tend to live in bubbles that sort of reinforce the views they have and make it so that they don't really engage with arguments on the other side. And while we could say a lot of things contributed to the 2016 election, I will agree that bubbles are probably at least part of the reason, though of course there's many other reasons as well. So let's talk about how these bubbles came into fruition, and then how we can sort of break down these bubbles and these barriers and sort of engage with our friends or family, people on the other side, in a peaceful and in a cordial manner. So I think the technology, not just of the internet, but just of society in general, in the 20th or in the 21st and the 20th century, contributed a long ways towards these bubbles. If you think back to society just a few centuries ago, a lot of people lived their whole lives in the area they were born. A lot of this was due to transportation costs. It wasn't as easy to go from one state to another, from one area to another, and set yourself up. Obviously, in today's time with, aircraft and a lot of job flexibility, people can easily grow up in one state and live in an entirely different one, and maybe live in several states throughout their lives. And because of that, people tend to pocket themselves and go in cities and areas which, more or less reflect their current political environment. But there's also other factors like demographics and stuff. And then, of course, with the internet and social media, people tend to follow the social media that suits them, that tends to lean towards their political orientation. So, of course, they're going to see similar views of that, and they're going to see less of the opposing view side. So I think it's not too hard to understand how bubbles came into fruition. So let's talk about how we break those bubbles down. So I'm going to list out 3 or 4 ways right here. First things first, we should actively engage with people at a personal level. There's nothing that angers me more. One of the things that really angers me is the notion that, this idea that politics should never be talked about at the dinner table. I do understand with certain individuals, especially people who will never accept change, that, okay, sometimes this can be a futile endeavor. But I think with the average person, especially if you're listening to this, you're probably in your 20s, around that demographic, there's still a lot of room for people to grow, to understand more about the world. And of course, you have to go in being humble, willing to admit that you might be wrong and that the other side has a point. But there's nothing wrong with having peaceful, cordial discussions of people. I mean, of course, you have to have, the facts right. You have to have the same level of facts and understanding. But then you can have a reasonable debate and sort of understand what the other side is talking about. I think unless we have these deep conversations, society as a whole is really damaged. I'm not just talking about elections in general. I'm just talking about the state of society is best when there's fruitful intellectual discussion happening at the everyday personal level, not just among pundits or politicians. Alright, so that's the first thing. And along with that first thing goes sort of the second thing, which is not just talking and engaging with other people, but actively reading and actively seeking out alternative viewpoints. So first, on the personal stage, I know there's actually been this recent trend among universities, especially universities that tend to have a liberal orientation, to ban certain speakers from speaking. And I think this is a horrible thing to do. You should always value freedom of speech, even if you don't agree with the speech, even if you think the speech might be somewhat harmful, you should still actively engage with those people, because if you ban them, they don't just go away, but they just become more insulated, they become stronger because they can point to the fact that they're being banned, and that only emboldens them further, and you're not able to call them out on their BS unless you have an active discussion with them. Now, the only exception to this is, I will say, sometimes universities do pay a speaking fee, and people can be upset that their university their tuition dollars are going to something they don't agree with. That I'm a little bit more understanding of, and I do believe universities should pay, for, housing and transportation and all that, but there shouldn't be an additional speaking fee, I don't think. But assuming that the university is just paying for, the cost of logistics, then I think more than fair, you should allow everyone who wants to speak have a platform. And you shouldn't ban people from speaking, certainly, especially at universities, because that's how you prevent intellectual discussion. That's how you prevent, if you think their views are horrible, that's how you call them out in this public forum, instead of allowing them to amass Twitter followers or whatever it may be and create this sort of silent majority effect. Alright, and when it comes to the more digital era, I would highly recommend, if you're someone who is actively keeping track of the news, first, to read the news in the first place if you aren't, and to look at multiple sources, of which I'd recommend The Guardian, The Atlantic, BBC News, Politico. There are many others, but you should look at a wide range of sources. Real Clear Politics is a great place for news, because what it does is it aggregates all the different news articles, so you can read news articles from a variety of sources. If you're on the more liberal-oriented side and you want to see more conservative arguments, I highly recommend Reason.com. It's a libertarian-oriented magazine, but they have very, very, very good arguments. They have very good articles. A lot of times I find myself actually agreeing with a lot of what they have to say. I don't obviously agree with a lot of what they have to say, but they oftentimes make reasonable arguments, and I feel like I get a better understanding by seeing the libertarian, or at least the Reason.com perspective. So for my liberal friends, I highly recommend a magazine like Reason.com. It has a lot of good conservative arguments. For my more conservative friends or libertarian friends on the liberal side, I'd recommend articles like The Atlantic is a good one. Mother Jones are fairly good sites. One other site for my liberal friends in terms of seeing conservative viewpoints. If you're really into economics, I'd really recommend the site Zerohedge. The site is a little funky, I will admit. Not in terms of just in terms of its layout and sort of philosophy. It's hard to explain unless you really know what Zerohedge is. But it's basically a financial reporter. It reports a lot of things on markets around the globe. They definitely have a strong libertarian slant to it, and they have a lot of opinions. But I think most of the times there is some facts to back it up, and it's an interesting perspective, to say the least, even if you don't agree with everything. So that being said, I think that's going to be the end of the podcast. I mean, that's simple. Let's break out of bubbles. Let's have discussions with people. Let's read alternative viewpoints. Let's allow people to speak, even if we think their views are bad, because I think it's all about the marketplace of ideas. Unless you debate these ideas outright and defeat them outright on the public stage, they won't ever truly be defeated, You have to expose them to the light, so to speak. So that being said, let me know what your thoughts on political bubbles are. Was there something I missed, something you disagreed with? Maybe you just want to shout out and say you did agree with it. I'd appreciate that too. Let me know if there's topics you want me to cover in my future podcasts, whether they be political or otherwise. And yeah, definitely let me know if you want to come on the show, because I love having banter. I love having alternative viewpoints instead of me just talking the whole time. My last podcast got 20 views. Granted, probably half of those are mine, but it's nice to know at least one other person that isn't me is listening. And hopefully, if I can aim for the same sort of view rate in this podcast, I'd also be happy. That being said, have a great night. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you have a great day or night or whatever it is. And yeah, like I said, definitely let me know if you want to participate in any way, shape, or form. All right, peeps. Peace out.